When a young woman suddenly stopped answering calls and disappeared without a word, her family immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. Police quickly launched an investigation, and at first it looked like the case would be solved without much difficulty. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the truth was far more complicated than anyone expected. What happened next resembled something straight out of a crime thriller, and when the shocking reality was finally uncovered, it stunned people across the country. Andrea was born on April 17, 1991, in Flint, Michigan. She lost her mother at a young age, and after some time, her father remarried. The family later settled in the small town of Otisville, where Andrea completed high school. After graduating, she found work at a nearby supermarket. Although she considered going to college, she hadn't yet decided what she wanted to study, so she focused on working and putting money aside for the future. While at the supermarket, she met a 19-year-old coworker named Kenneth, and before long, the two began dating. In November 2011, when Andrea was 20, her aunt and uncle left town and asked her to watch over their house while they were away. Since she was still living with her parents, she moved into their home for a few days. During the first part of their trip, Kenneth and another friend stopped by to spend time with her, watching movies and hanging out. They later made plans to meet again on the evening of November 14. Andrea was supposed to pick Kenneth up that night, but shortly beforehand she texted him, saying she couldn't make it. Instead, she asked him to come to her aunt and uncle's house and bring a few movie DVDs. Kenneth arrived around 7:30 p.m., only to find the house completely dark. The doors were locked, Andrea's car was gone, and no one answered when he knocked. He called her several times without success and assumed she had stepped out for a while, so he waited. Roughly 30 minutes later, Andrea finally sent him a text explaining that her plans had changed and that they would see each other the following day. She never mentioned where she was, and she ignored every message Kenneth sent after that. The next day passed without a single word from Andrea. At first, Kenneth was the only one concerned because her family believed she was still staying at her relative's home. But when another day went by and Andrea wasn't answering her father's calls either, he began to worry. He asked another family member to check the house, and she went there with Kenneth. They searched around the property and looked through the windows, but no one was inside. Andrea's father then contacted her friends, only to discover that none of them had spoken to her in over a day. Fearing the worst, the family organized a search. Friends and relatives split into groups and drove through nearby towns, parks, and other places Andrea might have gone. Later that evening, one of her friends found Andrea's car abandoned in a remote area near a national park, only a few miles from her aunt and uncle's house. The vehicle was unlocked, the keys were missing, and Andrea was nowhere to be found. Her father immediately contacted police. After notifying Andrea's uncle, officers forced their way into the house. In the basement, they made a devastating discovery. Andrea was sitting in a chair with a fatal gunshot wound to the head. An autopsy later confirmed she had been killed by a single gunshot fired from several feet away. Investigators determined she had died 2 days before her body was found, on the very night she unexpectedly canceled her plans with Kenneth. The medical examiner also found marks on her wrists, indicating she had been restrained with plastic zip ties, even though the restraints themselves were missing. Evidence suggested they had been removed 6 or 7 hours after her death, leading investigators to believe the killer had either returned later or remained inside the house for hours after the murder. Detectives also discovered that several items had been taken from the home, but the scene didn't resemble a typical burglary. Expensive valuables had been left untouched, while unusual items including a bottle of perfume, a sweater, a camera, 3 knives, a rifle, some ammunition, and a small amount of cash were missing. Jewelry and even a piece of solid gold left in plain sight had been ignored. As crime scene investigators processed the house, detectives learned Andrea had a boyfriend and immediately went to question Kenneth. He willingly described the last time he had seen her, provided fingerprints and a DNA sample without hesitation, and allowed police to collect the clothes he had worn that evening and search his home. Nothing suspicious was found. Even so, investigators continued to focus on him and gradually began treating him as their primary suspect. Kenneth firmly denied any involvement and even agreed to take a polygraph examination, which indicated no signs of deception. He explained that after Andrea unexpectedly canceled their plans on November 14, he was heartbroken and assumed she intended to end their relationship. He went home, charged his phone, and texted a female friend, telling her he believed Andrea was about to break up with him. After exchanging messages for a while, he drove to the store where she worked. They continued talking there before she invited him to watch a movie with her and her roommate later that night. Kenneth arrived at their apartment around 10 p.m., something both women later confirmed. His cell phone records also supported his story by placing him near their location at that time. Surveillance footage additionally captured him at a gas station about 20 minutes earlier, along the route between the store and the apartment. That same evening, investigators learned that someone had withdrawn $300 using Andrea's bank card in the town of Davison, roughly a 30-minute drive from her aunt and uncle's house. The withdrawal occurred only 7 minutes after Kenneth arrived at his friend's apartment, making it impossible for him to have been in both places at once. Even with that evidence, detectives still weren't prepared to rule him out. Kenneth remained with his friends until around midnight before finally heading home. The next morning, he tried calling Andrea several times, but she never picked up. Concerned, he drove back to her relative's house around 10 a.m. and knocked on the door, but there was still no sign of her. So, he left. By about 11 a.m., he was back home. Something confirmed by both his family members and his phone's location data. At almost the exact same time, another $300 was withdrawn from Andrea's account. This time, in a different town, even farther away. Police also got hold of surveillance footage showing the person using her card. The quality was too poor to make out a face, but one detail stood out. The suspect had arrived in a white pickup truck. But even with all the evidence pointing away from him, police still weren't ready to let Kenneth off the hook. They thought there were a few things about his story that didn't add up. First, he had admitted that he drove to Andrea's relative's house right around the time she was killed and sat in his car outside for about half an hour, which sounded weird for detectives. Second, when Andrea's friends and family organized a search for her on the evening of November 15th, Kenneth told them he wouldn't be joining because he had to work early the next morning. Later, he explained to detectives that he'd already spent the entire day trying to find her, calling her over and over, and figured she was just ignoring him. In his mind, Andrea had probably decided to break up with him, not that something bad had happened. Another red flag came up when one of Kenneth's friends, who'd been out searching for Andrea, asked him for the address of her relative's house. For some reason, Kenneth gave him the wrong location about 3 miles from the real one. Investigators thought this was strange since Kenneth had spent plenty of time there before. None of this was solid proof of guilt, but detectives pressed him harder and harder, piling on over 10 hours of interrogations. And eventually, police announced that Kenneth had finally confessed to the crime. In his written confession, Kenneth claimed that he went over to Andrea's that night and walked into the house. When he went down to the basement, he said he saw her body lying on the floor and assumed she did it herself. According to him, that's when he decided to stage the scene to look like a murder, so her family wouldn't find out the truth. He admitted to taking a few items that were lying nearby, but offered little else. The confession itself was short, vague, and full of ambiguous wording. Kenneth insisted he hadn't killed Andrea, only that he'd found her body. But detectives believe they finally had what they needed, and they placed him under arrest. The moment police told him he was being charged with murder, Kenneth immediately tried to retract his statement. He said detectives had pressured him for hours, hammering him with accusations until he was completely exhausted. Finally, they told him that if he just wrote down a version of events where he found Andrea's body, they would let him go home. Kenneth said he believed them, but instead his so-called confession became the cornerstone of the case against him. He also claimed detectives repeatedly misled him. They told him they had solid forensic evidence tying him to the crime, and that he had failed the polygraph miserably. But the most shocking detail came out later. Kenneth's grandfather had actually hired a lawyer and sent him to the station to help. When the attorney tried to find out where Kenneth was being held, one of the detectives simply hung up the phone and then warned his colleagues not to reveal Kenneth's location to anyone. The lawyer spent the entire day calling every officer he could reach, but no one would give him answers. Meanwhile, Kenneth had no idea that the lawyer was even trying to reach him, and he continued talking to detectives alone. According to Kenneth, his so-called confession was nothing more than him parroting back what detectives told him to say, just so they'd finally let him go home. In reality, he claimed he had no idea Andrea was even dead. Less than 24 hours after Andrea's body was found, detectives announced they had their killer. Kenneth's friends and family refused to believe he was involved, but at that point, there wasn't much they could do. Meanwhile, police basically shut down the investigation, convinced Kenneth's confession would be enough to secure a conviction. Forensics, however, painted a very different picture. Lab experts tested dozens of samples collected from the house, including skin found under Andrea's fingernails. The DNA turned out to belong to an unknown male, and it was definitively not a match to Kenneth. Later, another sample was recovered from Andrea's car, and it matched that same unidentified man. Then there was the whole deal with Andrea's bank card. Someone had been draining her account, but it clearly wasn't Kenneth. And police still had no clue who that mystery man could be. Despite these glaring red flags, just days after Kenneth's arrest, detectives claimed they had new evidence. One officer opened the sealed bag containing Kenneth's clothes from the night Andrea vanished and noticed a single bloody hair stuck to his pants. Test revealed the hair and blood both belonged to Andrea. But this supposed smoking gun had a huge problem. The pants themselves show no trace of blood, not even microscopic particles. The forensic specialist who examined the item concluded that the hair must have landed there hours after Andrea's death. Because if Kenneth had been wearing those pants during the murder, blood spatter would have been unavoidable. Kenneth's lawyer argued that the hair was most likely contamination. Police had grabbed Kenneth's clothes barely 30 minutes after Andrea's body was found. It was entirely possible that an officer, still carrying trace evidence from the crime scene, accidentally transferred the hair onto the pants while packing up his belongings. Kenneth's lawyer also pushed to have his confession thrown out, arguing that police had deliberately blocked him from seeing his client during questioning. On top of that, portions of the interrogation video had mysteriously gone missing, precisely the parts where, according to Kenneth, detectives were practically feeding him the right answers. The legal back and forth dragged on for 4 years until the court finally sided with the prosecution and ruled the confession would stay in. During all this time, Kenneth remained out on bail, but he was far from free. He had to wear a GPS ankle monitor and wasn't allowed to leave his house without police approval. The trial began in 2015, and the prosecution leaned on just 2 pillars: Kenneth's confession and the bloody hair found on his pants. Their theory was that the murder was committed during a robbery, even though none of the stolen items ever turned up in Kenneth's possession, and the victim's bank card was clearly used by someone else. The prosecutor tried to smooth over the contradiction by suggesting the robbery was staged. In other words, he argued Kenneth killed Andrea to steal money and valuables, yet also insisted he faked the robbery. This argument was shaky at best, especially since Kenneth's family was well off and he wasn't desperate for cash. The prosecution also pointed to another detail. There were no signs of forced entry at the house, and Kenneth had a spare key. Andrea had given it to him just a few days before she died so he could stop by whenever he wanted. But Kenneth insisted he had left the key on a table in the house 2 days before her death. His friend, who had been with him that day, backed up his story, and sure enough, police eventually found the spare key right where he said it would be. The defense, on the other hand, pointed to countless inconsistencies in the case and outright sloppy police work. They also highlighted something investigators seemed to ignore. Andrea's car had been taken and later abandoned a few miles from the house. Her father testified that the car had one particular problem. Oil constantly leaked onto the floor under the driver's seat, which meant Andrea's shoes were always stained. By that logic, anyone who drove the car would have gotten oil on their soles too. Yet, when experts examined Kenneth's boots, there wasn't a trace of it. The prosecutor fired back with a new theory. Kenneth must have had an accomplice. According to this version, Kenneth killed Andrea while the accomplice took the stolen items, drove off in her car, and used her bank card. But another problem loomed over the prosecutor's case. The murder weapon was never found. Investigators determined that the missing rifle from Andrea's uncle's house didn't match the bullet that killed her, and neither did Kenneth's parents' guns. Finally, Kenneth's lawyer accused police of completely overlooking other viable suspects. From the very beginning, they had tunnel vision on Kenneth and never gave anyone else a serious look. To prove the point, the defense presented a list of 5 potential suspects, and on the top of that list was a man named Jeffrey, a mutual acquaintance of both Kenneth and Andrea. There were a few red flags around Jeffrey. First, he was the one who just happened to find Andrea's car in the early hours of the search, even though it was parked miles away from her house in a fairly secluded spot. Second, that same day, he called Kenneth asking questions about Andrea's whereabouts. The odd thing was, Kenneth had never given him his number. Investigators later learned Andrea had scribbled his number on a piece of paper and left it on a nightstand right next to where an unidentified DNA sample was later recovered. On top of all that, Jeffrey owned a car that looked very similar to the one caught on surveillance footage at a gas station when someone was withdrawing money with Andrea's bank card. Andrea's brother also pointed investigators toward another possible suspect. He admitted that he had been struggling with drugs at the time and owed money to a local dealer. According to him, this dealer somehow knew Andrea had been saving a good amount of cash from her job. That's why her brother believed the dealer might have killed Andrea to get the money he was owed. There was also a young man named David who came onto police radar after his own father caught in a tip, telling them his son could be involved in Andrea's murder. David already had a criminal history tied to car thefts and assaults, and he even resembled the man seen withdrawing money from Andrea's bank card. Despite all this, detectives claimed they had looked into each of these leads, but couldn't find any hard evidence linking them to the crime. When the trial wrapped up, the jury deliberated for 2 full days before reaching a verdict. In the end, they found Kenneth guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. His lawyer immediately filed an appeal. At first, the defense tried to overturn the conviction by arguing that Kenneth's confession was coerced and that police illegally denied him access to a lawyer. But the court rejected that motion. Next, the defense focused on the robbery charge, pointing out that Kenneth was also found guilty of theft, even though none of the stolen items were ever recovered. That appeal also went nowhere, but the third attempt finally paid off. Kenneth's lawyer discovered a serious mistake in the jury paperwork. On the verdict forms, jurors were given 2 separate murder charges to consider: first degree and second degree. For the first-degree charge, they had both options: guilty or not guilty. But for second-degree, there was only one option listed: guilty. In other words, the jury had no way to find Kenneth not guilty on the second-degree charge. Their only choice was to decide how guilty he was. The appeals court couldn't ignore such a major flaw. And in 2018, Kenneth was granted a brand new trial. By that point, he had already spent 3 years behind bars. And after the ruling, he was released on bail once again. Since then, Kenneth's lawyer kept pushing for new evidence, something that could finally point to the real killer. He repeatedly urged police to retest the existing DNA samples, and in 2022, they finally agreed to launch a fresh review. By that time, Kenneth's new trial still hadn't begun, and he remained out on bail. Forensic experts went back through every unidentified male DNA sample connected to the case. But once again, there were no matches in the FBI's database. So they focused on the strongest piece of evidence they had: a cigarette butt found outside the house. That sample matched the same man whose skin cells had been discovered under Andrea's fingernails, leaving no doubt he was the real killer. Investigators sent the cigarette butt to Arthram, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. In January 2023, experts reported a breakthrough. By searching public genetic databases and tracing family connections, they had identified a likely suspect. It was a 42-year-old man named Chadwick Moley, someone who had never even come up in the original case files. Detectives learned that at the time of Andrea's murder, Chadwick had been living just 40 minutes away in a neighboring town. They pulled his phone records from November 2011 and found out that on the day Andrea was killed, his phone pinged off a tower near her aunt and uncle's house 23 times. By 2023, Chadwick was living in Utah, working as a delivery driver and staying out of his van. Investigators reached out to local police, asking them to secretly collect something with his DNA on it. But there was a problem, since Chadwick usually parked in open areas. Tailing him without being noticed was nearly impossible. For the next 2 months, officers quietly kept Chadwick under surveillance, hoping he would throw away something that could provide a usable DNA sample. But despite their efforts, they came up empty-handed. With no other option, detectives obtained a warrant and approached Chadwick directly to collect his DNA. During the interview, he insisted he had nothing to do with Andrea's murder. However, the laboratory results told a very different story. His DNA matched the evidence found beneath Andrea's fingernails, inside her car, and at several locations throughout the house. Then came another major breakthrough. A search of Chadwick's van uncovered a revolver, and forensic testing confirmed it was the same firearm used to kill Andrea. Just 2 days after speaking with him, officers returned to take Chadwick into custody, only to discover he had disappeared. Sometime after that initial conversation, he had simply driven away without telling anyone where he was headed. Nearly 3 weeks later, authorities tracked him down in Montana, close to the Canadian border, and placed him under arrest. But the case took yet another unbelievable turn. While officers were transporting him to the airport to extradite him back to Michigan, Chadwick somehow managed to free himself from both his handcuffs and leg restraints before escaping from the transport van. Once again, he vanished. A few days later, a sheriff on routine patrol unexpectedly spotted him paddling a canoe down a nearby river. That chance encounter led to his recapture, and this time he was successfully returned to Michigan, where he was jailed to await trial. Given that he had already escaped custody twice, the court denied him bail without hesitation. Chadwick entered a plea of not guilty, while prosecutors prepared to present their case. For investigators, the situation had become deeply embarrassing. They had spent more than 10 years insisting Kenneth was responsible for Andrea's murder, despite now having DNA evidence and the murder weapon pointing squarely at Chadwick. Detectives even explored whether the two men might have known each other or worked together, but they found absolutely no connection. Kenneth and Chadwick had never crossed paths, and there was no indication Andrea knew Chadwick either. At the time of the murder, Chadwick was a 32-year-old man living in a neighboring town with no known ties to the victim. Even with this overwhelming evidence, Kenneth's conviction remained in place. Instead of dismissing the case against him, prosecutors announced they intended to move forward with another trial, arguing that Kenneth and Chadwick had acted together. In the end, Chadwick never faced a full trial. In February 2025, he entered a no-contest plea, choosing not to challenge the charges, while also refusing to formally admit guilt. He told the judge he had been heavily intoxicated on the night Andrea was killed and could not remember what happened, though he did not deny being involved. During that hearing, another troubling detail emerged. Detectives had actually considered Chadwick as a possible suspect in the earliest days of the investigation. Yet for reasons no one could explain, his name never officially became part of the case file. By that point, investigators had already locked onto Kenneth as their primary suspect, despite the DNA evidence excluding him and the fact that the murder weapon had never been linked to him. Chadwick was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before leaving the courtroom, he apologized directly to Andrea's family for his actions. But for Kenneth, the ordeal was far from over. His attorney immediately asked the court to dismiss the remaining charges, but prosecutors refused, insisting Chadwick's conviction did not rule out Kenneth's alleged involvement. They remained determined to pursue a second trial even after Chadwick himself stated he acted alone and had never known either Kenneth or Andrea. That new trial is now scheduled for January 2026, while Kenneth continues living under house arrest with an electronic ankle monitor. Meanwhile, his legal team hired a respected forensic specialist who reviewed the blood-stained hair found on Kenneth's pants. The expert reached the same conclusion as the earlier analysis, that the hair could only have been transferred several hours after Andrea's death, not during the murder itself. Considering the DNA evidence, the recovered murder weapon, Chadwick's conviction, and the forensic findings, Kenneth appears to have a strong chance of finally proving his innocence. Even so, the years he lost can never be returned. More than 14 years of his life have been consumed by prison, house arrest, and legal battles. Even if his name is eventually cleared, the time taken from him is gone forever. And should he choose to seek accountability from the investigators and prosecutors responsible for the case against him, that fight could stretch on for years, with no certainty that justice will ever fully make up for everything he endured. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like. Let's move on to the next case. A woman suddenly stopped responding to her family and friends, and nobody knew where she had gone. That uncertainty lasted until police stepped in, and what followed quickly became one of the most bizarre and complicated cases investigators had ever encountered. Even decades later, people remain fascinated by the story. And although the case has officially been solved, many parts of it still leave people struggling to make sense of what really happened. Andrea Kenkato was born on May 10, 1946, in Washington, D.C. After graduating from high school, she enrolled at George Washington University, and not long after finishing college, she met a man named Howard. The two got married and had a son together, but the marriage eventually ended in divorce. Afterward, Andrea and her son relocated to Arlington, just outside Washington, where she accepted a job at a local library and quickly developed a passion for the work. Andrea loved books and enjoyed learning about almost anything, so the library felt like the perfect place for her. She regularly volunteered for extra shifts and rarely took time off. She was also very active and made a habit of swimming laps every morning before heading to work. In 1988, at the age of 42, Andrea met a man named James, and they began a relationship. James was only 26, but neither of them seemed concerned about the age difference. 3 years later, they got engaged and moved in together, renting an apartment in a small complex located in a pleasant neighborhood. Around the same time, they purchased a piece of land outside the city and started building what they hoped would become their dream home. They handled much of the work themselves and invested a tremendous amount of time and effort into the project. Over the following years, the couple settled into a comfortable routine. They continued planning their wedding while slowly working on the house. James worked as a geologist for several engineering firms and also picked up extra shifts at a building supply store, while Andrea remained at the library. Her son, who had lived with them for years, eventually moved out, leaving the two of them on their own. By 1998, Andrea was 52 years old, and she and James had been together for roughly a decade. On August 21st, she was excited about something she rarely got to enjoy: a full day off. She normally spent most of her time working, but this day was different. She had plans to meet a friend for lunch and later spend the evening with James. They were either going to see a movie or rent one and stay home together. That morning, Andrea followed her usual routine. She went swimming, briefly stopped by work, and returned home at around 11 a.m. She sent an email confirming to her friend that she would meet her at the restaurant at 1 p.m. But Andrea never arrived. Her friend called the house several times, but no one answered, assuming Andrea had gotten delayed or changed her plans. Around 6 p.m., James returned home from work and noticed Andrea wasn't there. Her car was also missing, so he assumed she was still out, either having lunch with her friend or taking care of something else. As the evening went on, he continued waiting for her to return, but she never did. Eventually, close to midnight, he went to bed. A little after 1:30 in the morning, James woke up and realized Andrea still hadn't come home. As he lay in bed, something in the room immediately caught his attention. The closet door in their bedroom, which was always left completely open, was now almost shut. The door was damaged and couldn't fully close, which was why they always kept it wide open. According to James, this was the first time he had ever seen it nearly closed. Curious and uneasy, he got out of bed and looked toward the closet. It was too dark to make out anything inside, so he switched on the light. That's when he saw her. Andrea's body was lying on the floor of the closet, pressed against the wall, and James instantly realized she was dead. He called 911, and paramedics soon arrived at the apartment. After examining the scene, they determined Andrea had been dead for several hours. Her body was transported for an autopsy, and detectives immediately launched an investigation. Their first step was speaking with James. He told investigators that he had arrived home at approximately 6:00 p.m., ate dinner, took a shower, and did some laundry. He said he never opened the closet door at any point, so he had no idea Andrea had been in the apartment the entire time. In other words, he'd been living just a few feet away from her body for roughly 7 hours before he found her. James also said several items were missing from the apartment, including Andrea's purse, her car keys, a green bag, and a few stacks of coins he'd been collecting. What didn't make sense was what the killer didn't take. There was cash sitting out in plain sight, plus other valuables, including an expensive watch still on Andrea's wrist. Later, James also noticed something else was gone. His mother's will had disappeared from a file drawer. When crime scene techs started processing the apartment, they were thrown by how little they were finding. It looked like the place had been thoroughly cleaned to the point they couldn't even tell where the attack happened. There were no obvious signs of a struggle and no clear traces left behind. Detectives also found no signs of forced entry, although James said that when he came home from work, the apartment door wasn't locked. In total, Text lifted around 600 fingerprints from all over the apartment. Almost all of them belonged to James, but none matched Andrea, and that was bizarre considering she lived there for 7 years. Even stranger, the closet door handle where her body was found had no prints at all, like someone had wiped it down on purpose. Same with the vacuum cleaner that had clearly been used after the killing. It was spotless. Not long after, the medical examiner finished the autopsy and ruled that Andrea died by strangulation. They also noted a few small bruises on her hands and other parts of her body, suggesting she'd fought back. But there were no major injuries, no signs of sexual assault, and no foreign DNA, which was yet another dead end for investigators. The one detail that really caught their attention was a small mark on Andrea's thigh. It was a triangle-shaped impression with a curved line running through it. With everything they had, detectives started leaning toward a personal motive because robbery didn't fit, and neither did anything sexual. Their first suspect was James. And for a few different reasons, detectives immediately started questioning James' story after they listened to his 911 call. He'd supposedly just found the body of his fiancée, the woman he'd been with for nearly 10 years. Yet, he sounded completely calm, like he was ordering a pizza. On top of that, they couldn't get past one detail. He'd spent a full 7 hours in the apartment with her body there, and somehow never noticed a thing. And then, in the middle of the night, he claimed he suddenly spotted that the broken closet door was almost closed in a dark room. And only then did he find Andrea. Police brought him in for an interview, and for hours he walked them through his entire evening step by step. He said that when he got home from work, the front door wasn't locked, and Andrea wasn't inside. But for some reason, that didn't seem to alarm him much. He took a shower, and then he noticed there were several messages on the answering machine in the bedroom, the one sitting right next to the same closet. James said that while he was listening to them, standing just a few feet from the slightly closed closet door, he also noticed something else. The bedroom carpet looked unusually clean, like someone had just vacuumed it, and he insisted it wasn't him. He said he hadn't cleaned the apartment, and that Andrea usually did the cleaning on weekends, not on a weekday. As for the messages, the first one was from Andrea's friend, the one who'd been waiting for her at the restaurant. She called to check if she was okay and asked why she'd missed their plans. The next 3 messages were from James himself. He'd been calling home from work, but nobody ever picked up. And the last message came from another friend of Andrea's. A relative of hers had ended up in the hospital, and Andrea had been helping by watching her kids while the family dealt with everything. The friend says she had bad news and asked Andrea to call her back as soon as she could. James told detectives that in that moment he assumed Andrea must have heard that last message and driven over to that friend. But then he also admitted something that didn't quite make sense. He said all 5 messages were still marked as unheard. After a while, he tried calling that friend back, hoping Andrea might be at her place, but no one answered. After that, James said he cleaned out his car, grabbed the trash bags from the apartment, and took them out to the dumpster near the complex. Then, he did laundry, hung everything up to dry, and sat down to watch TV. Later that night, he went to bed in the bedroom with the closet, the same closet where Andrea was later found, and fell asleep. A few hours later, he woke up and while still lying in bed, noticed the closet door looked more closed than usual. He got up, walked over, and that's when he discovered her body. Detectives also pointed out that the laundry baskets James had been using were sitting right next to the closet, meaning he'd been right up against that area multiple times that evening, close enough that it was hard to believe he wouldn't have noticed anything. James also told them that at one point he couldn't find his keys and carefully searched the entire bedroom, but he still insisted he never saw his fiance's body. And there was another detail that stood out. A detective asked why, when he called 911, he did it from the second bedroom, the one that used to belong to Andrea's son, instead of calling from his own room. James said there was an old rotary phone in the master bedroom that he wasn't used to anymore. So, he went to the other room to use a more familiar push-button phone. In total, police spent dozens of hours interviewing James, but he kept insisting he was innocent. After one of those interviews, he called detectives and said he'd stumbled across Andrea's car while driving home. It was parked on the shoulder across the river from Arlington. Forensics found the clutch had been burned out, so the car couldn't be driven. And on top of that, they couldn't recover a single usable fingerprint or DNA sample. It looked like someone had thoroughly wiped the car down before dumping it there. Not long after, investigators uncovered another detail that seemed to point back to James. Remember that odd triangular mark on Andrea's thigh? Analysts compared it to the shoes James had been wearing that night and said the tread pattern on his sneakers was a match. They also noted the imprint could have been left if Andrea's skin was wet, like she'd been attacked shortly after getting out of the shower. Still, even with all of those circumstantial signs, detectives ran into a major problem. The medical examiners estimated Andrea was killed around 1 p.m., while James didn't get home from work until about 6. Police dug into his alibi, interviewed his co-workers, and concluded he simply couldn't have been back at the apartment earlier that afternoon, meaning he wouldn't have had the chance to do it, and motive was another issue. Everyone close to them described Andrea and James as happy. No obvious tension, no big fights, nothing that screamed this was coming. Still, detectives did learn something new. In one of his later interviews, James admitted he spent a lot of time on adult websites with paid live streams, and that he'd poured a fair amount of money into them. He also said he'd started talking to one of the women who worked there, though it never went beyond emails. Even so, he kept insisting he had nothing to do with Andrea's murder, and police still couldn't actually tie him to it. So, with no other real leads, they decided to try a different tactic. They brought him in again and told him the medical examiner had now nailed down the exact time of death, and that Andrea had been killed after James got home. They also claimed they'd found his fingerprint on her body. None of that was true, but detectives are allowed to bluff like that to try to shake something loose, and they left out one key detail on purpose. They didn't tell James how Andrea died because they were hoping he'd slip and reveal it himself. James still denied killing her, but before long, his story started to shift. Carefully choosing his words, he said that if his prints had supposedly been found on her body, then maybe he'd moved her into the closet for some reason. Even though he claimed he had absolutely no memory of doing that, he kept saying he couldn't remember anything different from his original version of events. And eventually, detectives asked him to walk through how the night could have gone hypothetically if he had killed Andrea. James kept insisting he had zero memory of killing her, but then he started talking anyway. He said that day they could have gotten into a fight because Andrea found out how much money he'd been spending on those adult live stream sites. Then he suggested he might have hit her a few times and that Andrea fell to the floor. And when he reached down to check her pulse, he realized she was dead. But even in this so-called confession, James never once mentioned the actual cause of death: strangulation. That basically killed the detective's hopes of using his story in court because his version didn't match the evidence. Still, the interview wasn't a total waste. Once James admitted the live stream obsession, detectives started digging into his behavior off the internet, and what they found wasn't great. They spoke to a woman who lived in the same complex. She told them that both that year and the year before, James had left her flowers on Valentine's Day. He'd also show up with cookies sometimes. And when Andrea was out of town with her son, James even came by with a movie on V8s. The neighbor also said he'd been watching her, popping up in places she went, like it wasn't a coincidence. And one time, someone even spotted him outside her apartment windows, looking in. On top of that, detectives learned James had gone on at least one date with another woman, something Andrea apparently didn't know about. So yeah, it definitely put a dent in the picture of this perfect relationship. But without a real confession, and with his alibi still holding up, police were basically stuck. As a result, detectives had to shift their focus away from James and start looking at other possibilities. After talking to Andrea's relatives and friends, they learned that none of them believed James was involved. Everyone described him as calm and non-confrontational, and even Andrea's son insisted police were wasting time on an innocent man. In fact, her son, along with several of Andrea's friends, said they believed they knew who the real killer was, and they pushed police to investigate him. According to them, a few weeks before Andrea died, she was getting ready to throw out her old computer. Around that same time, a maintenance company was doing some work in their apartment complex, and Andrea asked one of the workers whether they took old computers for recycling. He told her no, but said he'd gladly take it for personal use. Andrea handed it over and even gave him her home phone number so he could reach her if he ran into any issues logging in or accessing the account. What shocked her loved ones most was what they learned next. Andrea had actually let the man into the apartment to pick up the computer, and she even walked him into the bedroom where it was kept. That's why Andrea's family and friends believed this worker could have been the one who killed her. He'd been inside her home, knew the layout, and could have easily gotten back in later just by knocking on the door and coming up with some excuse about the computer. After police hit a dead end with James, they finally tracked down this man, a worker named Bobby, and they quickly realized he might be their guy. Just days after Andrea was murdered, Bobby was arrested for attacking his ex-wife, and that was only the start. He had a long criminal history, including sexual assaults, beatings, and other violent offenses. Detectives went to the jail to interview him, but he denied having anything to do with Andrea's murder. He also agreed to give a DNA sample and fingerprints, but the problem was investigators basically had nothing solid to compare them to. So, the case stalled again. About a year later, Bobby was arrested all over again. This time, he attacked a woman, started choking her, actually assaulted her, and dragged her into a closet. He thought he'd killed her, but she survived, and she was able to identify him. Bobby was sentenced to life in prison, and Andrea's investigators couldn't ignore how eerily similar that assault was to what happened in Andrea's apartment. But they still had one major problem. There was no physical evidence tying Bobby to Andrea's case. Because of that, the case hit another wall. And for years, police couldn't make any real progress. At one point, Andrea's family hired a private investigator, and she came to the same conclusion they had. Bobby was the most likely killer. And instead of building a case against him, detectives had spent years going after James, with nothing solid to back it up. And what made it even stranger was this. Despite all the red flags around Bobby, investigators officially crossed him off the suspect list. To Andrea's family, that made no sense. But there was nothing they could do. Over the years that followed, detectives still treated James as their main suspect. But he kept insisting, again and again, that he had nothing to do with Andrea's death. In 2013, 15 years after Andrea was killed, the case was handed over to the cold case unit. The new detectives went back through everything from scratch, and at first, it didn't lead anywhere. Still, unlike the investigators before them, they weren't in a hurry to rule out Bobby. His record and the way he'd attacked other victims made it hard to ignore him. By then, he was already serving life with basically no chance of ever getting out. And in 2018, after years of hitting dead ends, detectives decided to try a different angle. They offered him a deal. If Bobby finally told the truth, the prosecutor wouldn't seek the death penalty. And since he wasn't going home either way, extra time didn't really mean anything to him. He agreed. So, detectives went to sit down and talk to him. 20 years after Andrea was killed, Bobby finally admitted he was the one who did it. He said that day he drove to her apartment complex and knocked on her door, using the computer she'd given him a few weeks earlier as an excuse. Andrea opened up. They talked for a bit in the hallway, and at some point, Bobby asked for something to drink. She said she'd grab him a soda, and the second she turned away, he lunged at her and started choking her. Bobby claimed she barely fought back, and once he was sure she was dead, he dragged her body into the closet. But that was just the beginning of his story, because then he laid out what he said was the motive. A couple days after Andrea handed him the computer, Bobby called her with a few questions. Andrea told him she didn't really know the technical stuff and handed the phone to a man Bobby described as either her husband or her boyfriend. The guy walked him through the settings. They hung up, and that should have been the end of it. Instead, Bobby said the man called him back a few days later, but this time it wasn't about the computer. He started asking personal questions about Bobby's life, his family, details that had nothing to do with anything. Bobby thought it was weird, but he answered anyway. Then the calls kept coming, and on one of them, the man made it clear he knew a lot about Bobby, his criminal history, the times he'd been locked up, the cases he'd been involved in. When Bobby asked how he knew all that, the man supposedly said he was an engineer and he knew how to find information. According to Bobby, that's when the man started hinting he had worked for him, staying vague for hours before finally saying what he wanted. Bobby claimed the man offered him $5,000 to kill Andrea quietly, without using a gun. He said the money would be waiting in a boot inside the bedroom closet. Bobby said the man even told him exactly when Andrea would be home around 1 p.m. So Bobby agreed, showed up at that time, used the computer story to get her to open the door, and asked for a drink so she turned her back. Then he followed her inside, killed her, ran a bath to check if she was still breathing, dragged her into the closet, and started looking for the promised cash. But when he searched the closet, the money wasn't there. Bobby said he tore through both closets in the apartment, checking every boot and digging through jacket pockets, but the money was nowhere to be found. That's when he noticed a large vase packed with coins. So he grabbed that instead, stuffed it into a gym bag, and figured he'd take the victim's car too, because the bag was too heavy. But he didn't get far. He burned out the clutch on the way. So he abandoned the car on the side of the road after wiping it down to get rid of his fingerprints. Back home, he counted the coins and said it came up to roughly $650. He was furious. He claimed he wanted to kill Andrea's boyfriend, the guy who'd set him up, and promised him $5,000. But he never got the chance, because not long after that, he was arrested for assaulting his ex-wife. So, Bobby gave detectives a huge amount of detail. But there was one major problem. The man who allegedly hired him never gave a name, and Bobby never met him face to face. From the detective's perspective, if Bobby was telling the truth, the mystery caller pretty much had to be James. There just weren't many other realistic options. And it didn't help that James often described himself as an engineer because he worked for engineering firms, even though his actual role was lower level. But that kind of logic didn't survive in court, and that was a brutal setback for the investigation. Still, detectives felt they were in the home stretch, and they started thinking about how they could actually prove James was involved. According to Bobby, he didn't bother cleaning up at all. He said there was water everywhere from the bathtub. The closets were trashed from him digging for the money, and the soda can he drank from was just left on the floor. But when police showed up after James' 911 call, the apartment was basically spotless. James had told investigators that after he got home from work, he took out some trash, but he insisted he never vacuumed or cleaned the place. Later, detectives showed Bobby the crime scene photos from that night, and he confirmed it. When he left, it looked nothing like that, meaning someone had come in after him and cleaned up. After detectives got all of that, they started thinking about how they could actually tie James to it. And instead of confronting him directly, they tried a pretty unusual move. Undercover officers approached him on the street, claimed they were Bobby's relatives, and demanded the $5,000 James supposedly owed him from back in 1998. The idea was to get him to slip up on tape, but it went nowhere. James refused to admit he owed anyone money, and pretty quickly, he said he wanted his lawyer, like he was starting to suspect these relatives were really connected to police. Not long after that, Andrea's son, Chris, made his own attempt to catch James. By then, the two of them barely spoke, and James had a new family. Chris hadn't believed James could have done it at first, but over the years, he started leaning more and more in that direction. So, he wanted to help detectives prove it. On the 20th anniversary of Andrea's murder, Chris invited James to dinner and secretly recorded the whole conversation. First, he asked why James had given police that false confession in the early months of the investigation. James said detectives had kept him awake through endless interviews, and his brain basically stopped working. Under that kind of pressure, he started convincing himself he must have done it. Later in the conversation, Chris asked whether James had vacuumed the apartment that night, and James said yes. That directly contradicted what he told police before, when he swore he never even touched the vacuum. Chris also felt like the motive was obvious. James had been spending a lot of money on adult live stream sites, and he'd been seeing other women on the side. Chris believed his mom may have found out, and if she left him, James would have had to move out. On top of that, he could have lost his stake in the unfinished house they were building out of town, or been forced to pay a large amount to buy Andrea's share. In the end, detectives were left with two possible scenarios. Either James pulled off something close to a perfect crime, hiring someone to kill his fiancée and leaving no clear trail back to him, or James became an accomplice without even realizing it by cleaning the apartment and wiping out evidence against Bobby, all while somehow not noticing Andrea's body in the closet. Even with a shaky case, the prosecutors decided to lean on Bobby's testimony, and in 2021, James was arrested. The trial started 2 years later, and his defense attorney immediately went after the investigators' early mistakes. He pointed out that police never even tried to track down the trash James said he took out that night. As for the vacuum bag, it sat untouched for nearly 2 decades. They only tested it right before trial, and by then, experts couldn't pull anything useful from it. According to the defense, Bobby really did commit the murder. But a lot of his story was either exaggerated or flat out made up. The defense attorney argued that Bobby may have been offered some kind of incentive, possibly a transfer to a better prison, in exchange for testifying against James, especially since investigators had spent years focusing on James as their primary suspect. He also kept returning to one major question. If Bobby was genuinely angry about never receiving the $5,000 he claimed he had been promised, then why wait 20 years before accusing James? Bobby was already serving a life sentence, and if revenge was truly his goal, he could have gone to authorities much earlier and tried to implicate James back then. The defense further pointed out that Bobby had committed similar violent crimes in the past, including an attempted murder, and he carried out those attacks on his own, without anyone paying. or directing him. Prosecutors pushed back by arguing that Bobby's previous crimes had a clear sexual motive, whereas Andrea's murder appeared to have no obvious motive or benefit for him. They also highlighted another important detail. At the time Bobby confessed to killing Andrea, he was already waiting for a transfer to a more comfortable correctional facility. However, once the new charges surfaced, that transfer was canceled. So rather than gaining something from confessing, he actually lost an opportunity. James' attorney responded by suggesting that investigators may have manipulated Bobby, hinting they could help arrange a transfer and leading him to believe they had the power to make it happen. In that scenario, Bobby may have confessed because he thought he would be rewarded. Bobby himself offered a different explanation, saying he had found religion and felt compelled by his conscience to finally tell the truth. As for James' alleged motive, the defense argued that the financial theory didn't hold up either. Chris had long suspected James feared losing the country house if the relationship ended, but during the trial it emerged that James alone owned the land where the house was being built, meaning a breakup wouldn't have forced him to pay Andrea anything. In the end, prosecutors played the recording of James's police interrogation, the same interview where he confessed. But it seemed to do more harm than good. Jurors heard detectives appearing to pressure him into admitting guilt, while making claims about evidence they didn't actually possess. They also learned that James's description of Andrea's death didn't match the known facts of the case. When the trial concluded, the jury needed less than an hour to reach a verdict. They found James not guilty, and he was released immediately from the courtroom. One juror later said they couldn't understand how investigators had built a case against him at all because there simply wasn't enough solid evidence. After being acquitted, James sued one of the detectives, alleging she had misled the jury. According to him, she testified that Bobby directly identified James as the person who hired him, even though Bobby reportedly said the individual never gave a name. Eventually, that lawsuit was dismissed. As for Bobby, he had already received a second life sentence for Andrea's murder before James's trial even began. In practical terms, it didn't change much, because he was already expected to spend the rest of his life in prison. Andrea's son was devastated by the verdict and never stopped believing James was involved in his mother's death. So from a legal standpoint, this complicated case is essentially over. The chances of James ever facing another trial are extremely slim. Under the law, he walked away an innocent man. Yet to this day, many people remain convinced that he played a direct role in Andrea's murder and ultimately got away with what they consider the perfect crime. Share your thoughts on this case in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button. Let's move on to the next case. A woman failed to show up for her shift at a daycare center, and her family immediately sensed that something wasn't right. Once police became involved, they began uncovering a series of suspicious clues. It didn't take investigators long to realize that something terrible had happened. But certain aspects of the case would eventually draw national attention, and even today, many people still find the story deeply disturbing. Christine Holloway was born on October 31st, 1976, in Connecticut. She was the oldest of 5 children, and from an early age she often helped her parents care for her younger siblings. Those experiences played a major role in shaping her future. Christine knew she wanted a career working with children. After graduating from college with a degree in psychology, she accepted a position as a preschool teacher in Bridgeport. Christine had a natural connection with children, and before long, she became one of the most valued employees at the daycare. Her coworkers often described her as incredibly patient and completely dedicated to the kids in her care. She was known for putting their needs first, even if it meant staying late or doing more than what was expected of her. Outside the classroom, Christine was heavily involved in her church and spent much of her free time volunteering in various charitable programs. For years, she continued doing work that she genuinely loved. But there was one thing she still hoped for. Christine spent her life caring for other people's children and dreamed of someday having a child of her own. She simply hadn't met the right person yet. That changed in 2016 when she met a man named Jose, and the two began a relationship. In September 2018, when Christine was 42 years old, they welcomed a daughter named Vanessa. Christine was absolutely thrilled. From that moment forward, she devoted herself to raising her little girl while continuing her work at the daycare. The following year, near the end of November, Christine, Jose, and Vanessa celebrated Thanksgiving with Jose's parents before returning home. 3 days later, on December 2nd, Christine was scheduled to work her usual shift at the daycare, but she never arrived. Her supervisor immediately felt that something was wrong because Christine was never late. If anything, she was usually one of the first people there, arriving early to prepare for the day. She also brought Vanessa with her every morning, meaning the little girl was normally at the daycare as well. At first, her supervisor assumed there had been a delay. It was a Monday morning following a major holiday, and bad weather or heavy traffic seemed like a reasonable explanation. But as the hours passed and Christine still hadn't shown up, she tried calling her. There was no answer. That's when the concern started turning into fear. The supervisor contacted Christine's family, who said they hadn't heard from her in several days. After trying to reach her themselves without any success, they contacted police and requested a welfare check. Since most of Christine's relatives lived in a nearby town, they asked officers to go to her residence and make sure everything was okay. At around 1 p.m., officers arrived at the home. Christine lived in a small multi-unit residence, essentially a single building divided into separate apartments. Her car was parked outside, but when officers knocked on the door, nobody responded. Almost immediately, they noticed something unusual. Despite temperatures being below freezing, several windows in Christine's apartment were partially open. The situation seemed suspicious, but officers didn't believe they had enough legal justification to force entry, so they left the scene. Back at the station, investigators contacted Jose to see if he knew where Christine and Vanessa might be. Jose told them he had seen both of them around 7 o'clock that morning when Christine left for work with the baby, and that he hadn't heard from her since. Not long afterward, Christine's brother arrived at the police station. By that point, the entire family was in full panic mode. No one had heard from her for hours, and they were starting to believe something was seriously wrong. With Christine's brother there, officers called Jose again, and this time, Jose suddenly changed his story. Earlier, he'd said he saw Christine that morning. Now, he claimed he actually wasn't home. He also told police Christine drove a gold 2002 Mazda, but her family said that was outdated. Just a week earlier, Christine had bought a black 2017 Ford Focus, and they said Christine had told them Jose helped her pick it out and even went with her to the dealership. Then, officers asked him a simple question. The black Ford parked outside Christine's place. Who did it belong to? Jose said he didn't know. All of it sounded extremely suspicious, so officers went back to Christine's place and started knocking on neighbors' doors. No one had seen Christine that day, but one neighbor did mention something that immediately raised alarms. He said he'd seen Jose coming out of her apartment that morning. With everything they had at that point, officers decided they couldn't wait any longer. No one had been able to reach Christine for more than 10 hours, and her daughter was missing too. So, they forced the door open. Inside, the lights were on, but the apartment was empty. The living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, nothing looked out of place. But as soon as one officer stepped into the bathroom, he started screaming. There was a woman's body in the bathtub with obvious injuries, and officers immediately called in backup. The medical examiner determined she'd been killed by 8 severe blows to the head, most likely with something heavy like a hammer. She was also completely unclothed, and it looked like her body had been dragged into the bathroom after the attack. As for the timeline, the examiner estimated she died sometime between Saturday night and early Sunday morning, more than a full day before she was found. In Christine's hand, investigators also found a clump of hair, something she likely ripped out of her attacker during the struggle. Forensics quickly concluded the attack happened in the living room and that Christine's body was moved into the bathroom afterward. But at first glance, there was almost no blood and no obvious signs of a struggle anywhere in the apartment. When they looked closer, the reason became clear. Someone had thoroughly cleaned the place. Blood had been scrubbed off the floors, the walls, and other surfaces. When investigators took apart the drain under the kitchen sink, they pulled out small bone fragments that appeared to be human. And under that same sink, they found a trash can filled with empty beer cans. Even though Christine didn't drink, detectives quickly confirmed the victim was Christine. But Vanessa was nowhere to be found. Inside the apartment, they found one little flip-flop that clearly belonged to her. But the matching one was missing, and they realized a lot of the baby's things were gone, too. The car seat, a white baby blanket, and a bag with her other stuff with Vanessa's favorite teething ring that actually gave detectives a small bit of hope. It suggested whoever took Vanessa might have been planning to keep caring for her, not hurt her. And when they tested every blood sample they could find, all of it came back to Christine. None of it matched Vanessa. While crime scene tags worked the apartment, detectives started talking to neighbors. One man who used a first-floor garage as a workshop said he'd been down there Friday evening around 5 p.m. He told police he'd heard a loud banging from the unit above, a man's voice yelling, and sounds like someone was dragging or moving furniture. Another neighbor said that on Saturday morning, he saw Jose outside the house, loading a car seat with a small child into a black Ford. A third neighbor told investigators he saw Jose leaving Christine's apartment on Monday afternoon, not long after police had first come by. Detectives pulled surveillance footage from outside the building and spotted Jose's vehicle driving away. After that, detectives started pulling camera footage from nearby streets, hoping to track movements in and out of the area. At the same time, their focus tightened on Jose, because between his behavior and what neighbors were saying, the picture was starting to look really bad. Officers went to the home of Jose's mother and stepfather where he was living and brought him in for questioning. At that point, detectives still hadn't told Christine's family what they'd found inside the apartment. So, officially, Christine and Vanessa were still being treated as missing. During the 40-minute ride to the station, Jose stayed oddly calm. He even commented on how nice the patrol car was, and he never once asked how the search for his daughter was going. In the interview room, he started saying he wasn't especially close to Christine or their daughter. He said he'd visit them on weekends, but during the week, he lived with his parents. He also mentioned he had 2 kids from a previous marriage who sometimes came to stay with him. Then, Jose started insisting he didn't do drugs and barely drank, even though no one had asked him. When detectives asked when he last saw Christine and Vanessa, he said it was Friday night. According to him, after Thanksgiving at his parents' house, everyone went their separate ways. Jose claimed he went to see a friend named Hector and spent most of the weekend with him in a nearby city. But he struggled to give police Hector's last name or even his address. One of the detectives also pointed out the obvious. Jose didn't seem even remotely worried about his missing girlfriend and daughter. Jose insisted he was worried and said he'd even tried calling Christine a few times, but claimed there wasn't much else he could do. About 40 minutes into the interview, he said he wanted to leave. Before letting him go, detectives asked if he'd hand over his clothes for DNA testing, and Jose agreed. When he took off his shirt, officers noticed several fresh bruises and scratches on his body. Jose claimed he had no idea where they came from. They also saw scrapes on his knuckles, the kind that can show up when someone's been throwing punches. But what really caught their attention was his clothes. Detectives spotted stains that looked like blood, along with something that looked like bits of skin, though they'd need lab testing to confirm what it actually was. And since they couldn't arrest him yet, they had to drive him back home. So, detectives used the moment to their advantage. They went inside with him and started talking to Jose's mother and stepfather. Once all three of them were in the same room, one of the detectives finally mentioned for the first time that Christine had been killed. Jose's mother immediately broke down, screaming, while Jose didn't show any obvious emotion at all. When she demanded to know what happened, detectives told her they were actually hoping her son would explain that, because he wasn't giving them anything. That's when Jose's mother turned on him and started pushing him to answer their questions. The detectives brought up Christine's car. Like we said earlier, Jose had first claimed she drove an older vehicle and acted like he didn't even know about the newer Ford. Now, with his mother right there, he suddenly backtracked. He claimed police had misunderstood him. He did know Christine had a new car. He said he just didn't know where it was. Now, his mother kept asking him directly what happened to Christine, and Jose just repeated over and over that he didn't know. But to the detectives, it didn't even look like his own mother believed him. Then she told detectives something else. On Friday night, Jose left their house at the same time as Christine, but in separate cars. Christine drove off in the new black Ford, and Jose left in his own vehicle. When police later reviewed surveillance footage from different cameras, they confirmed that for at least part of the route, Jose was driving behind Christine. Though they couldn't piece together the entire trip, Jose still insisted he went to see his friend and didn't see Christine all weekend. But his mother immediately corrected him. She said she'd FaceTimed him over the weekend. And during that call, Jose was clearly inside Christine's apartment. Jose tried to explain it away by saying he'd used his friend's phone, then quickly switched it and said he'd actually called her from his iPad. But even then, he kept insisting he was at his friend's place, not at Christine's. Despite what his own mother had just told detectives told Jose's mother they already had surveillance footage and witnesses placing him around Christine's home on Saturday and Sunday. That pushed things over the edge. Jose's mother basically started interrogating him alongside the police, demanding he finally say where he really was over the weekend. And on Monday morning, too, when a neighbor spotted him again, Jose froze up and couldn't give a straight answer. One detective pointed out that he wasn't exactly rushing to help them here. And Jose tried to brush it off by saying basically with this kind of pressure, I can't think. And that he wasn't exactly the most clear-minded person in general. After a beat, he snapped and started yelling at his mom. Jose insisted he'd FaceTimed her from Hector's place, but he pretended he was at Christine's because he didn't want his mom knowing he was hanging out with a friend instead of being with family. While that was going on, other investigators were working on a warrant, and the second it was signed, they seized Jose's iPad. Sure enough, it showed an outgoing FaceTime call to his mother, and forensic techs confirmed that at the time of the call, the iPad was connected to Christine's apartment Wi-Fi. But it didn't stop there. When detectives pulled Jose's phone records, they found he'd called 911 at around 2 a.m. on Saturday, and at that moment, his phone was pinging off a tower near Christine's place. They listened to the call and the voice sounded like Jose. He sounded drunk, slurring, barely getting words out. He gave the operator the street where Christine lived, but he didn't give a house number and he never explained why he was calling. Then, in the background, detectives heard a woman's voice say, "Stop. Who are you calling? Hang up." Police believed that was Christine. which would mean she was still alive at that point. That night, dispatch did send a patrol car to the street, and officers drove through the area, but they didn't see anything that stood out, and the evidence kept stacking up. After taking the iPad, police also searched Jose's parents' house. In his bathroom, they found towels and rags with what looked like bloodstains. There was a black plastic bag with blood inside. Later testing confirmed the blood belonged to Christine. Her blood was also found inside the car itself, including on the pedals. Soon, detectives tracked down Jose's friend, Hector. At first, he backed up Jose's story and claimed Jose really had been with him the entire weekend. But later, he changed his statement. He admitted Jose had asked him to lie, and in reality, Jose kept taking off and was gone for most of the weekend. Forensic teams also finished combing through hundreds of hours of surveillance footage. They found that around 6 a.m. on Saturday, Jose's car left the street where Christine lived. He stopped at a gas station and tried to buy cigarettes, but his debit card was declined. Later that same day, he was seen leaving Christine's place in her black Ford, and where he went after that is still unclear. What stood out even more was this. During that time, Christine's phone was moving around the city right alongside Jose's phone, even though investigators believe she was already dead. Detectives also noted that by Monday morning, both Jose's car and Christine's car were parked outside her place again, right up until the moment officers first showed up. Something that's visible on body cam footage. Based on the timeline, they believe that while police were knocking at the door, Jose was likely inside the apartment. Not long after, police got a call that helped connect another dot in Jose's timeline. It came from staff at a local church in the same direction Jose had been driving repeatedly that weekend. They had donation bins out front, and on December 5th, employees started sorting through the items left inside. That's when they found a bag stuffed with blood-covered items. Children's clothes, toys, women's clothing, and even letters addressed to Christine. One of the staff members Googled her name, saw the active investigation, and immediately called the police. Investigators took the donated clothes and toys into evidence. Mixed in with the children's stuff, they also found men's t-shirts and button-downs, the same size Jose wore. And there was something else, too. A child's flip-flop in the same brand as the single sandal police had already found inside Christine's home. Lab testing later confirmed that every blood sample on those items belonged to Christine. None of it matched Vanessa's DNA. As for the missing car seat, the blanket, the bag, and Vanessa's teething ring, none of those items were found. So, police had no concrete reason to believe the little girl had been harmed. But her whereabouts were still completely unknown. The FBI quickly joined the search, offered a $10,000 reward for Vanessa's safe return, and even promised immunity to anyone who brought her back alive and unharmed. Meanwhile, the evidence against Jose had piled up to the point that detectives finally had enough to arrest him and charge him with murder. When it came to Vanessa, Jose still insisted he had no idea where she was. But after hours of questioning, his story started shifting. At one point, he claimed that over the weekend, he and Hector had been using powerful drugs, the kind that can cause hallucinations and leave you disoriented. Because of that, he barely remembered what happened. According to Jose, his memory was only coming back little by little. He then admitted he actually was at Christine's apartment late Friday into Saturday. And this is where his story got even stranger. Jose said 2 unknown men burst in, pinned him to the floor, and attacked Christine. He claimed he couldn't fight back because he was high and barely conscious. But then he started giving police oddly specific details like he remembered every step. He said the men hit him, and he blacked out. But then he also claimed that while he was down on the floor, he saw one of them carry Vanessa out. Jose said Christine tried to stop him, and that's when she was killed. He described their movements almost minute by minute, all while insisting he was basically unconscious. Before they left, he claimed one of the men warned him, called the police, and they'd hurt his daughter. Jose said he fell asleep after that and didn't wake up until morning. He claimed he barely remembered the night before, started searching for Vanessa, and realized she was gone. Then he saw Christine's body and said he wanted to call 911, but panicked because of the threat. And then comes the part that made detectives completely skeptical. Instead of calling for help, Jose claimed he cleaned up. He said he dragged Christine into the bathroom, stripped her, washed her clothes, and hung them up to dry, then grabbed a bucket and rags and started scrubbing the living room. After that, he said he bagged up the bloody items and dumped them in a donation bin. Over the next few days, he just kept going and eventually returned to his parents' house like nothing had happened. Of course, investigators didn't buy his story for a second. They found no evidence that Jose was on any kind of hallucinogens. At first, investigators believed Jose had simply been intoxicated, especially considering the number of empty beer cans they discovered in the trash. And when they looked closer at his claims about being under the influence of drugs, detectives weren't convinced. They argued that someone in that condition wouldn't have been capable of thoroughly cleaning an apartment and then driving around town afterward. People on substances like that often struggle with basic coordination, let alone scrubbing a crime scene and running errands behind the wheel. As the investigation continued, detectives learned that Jose and Christine's relationship had been troubled for quite some time, and that his behavior had become increasingly hostile in the months leading up to her death. When police gained access to their text messages, they found a consistent pattern. Jose frequently insulted Christine, acted possessive, and tried to control different aspects of her life. Just weeks before the murder, he had even pressured her to cancel her gym membership because he was convinced she might meet other men there. Despite all of that, Christine continued trying to save the relationship, largely because she wanted Jose to remain involved in their daughter's life. She would send messages saying she wanted to work through their problems and fix what was broken, only to receive insults in return or be told to leave him alone. Then investigators uncovered another piece of information that Christine herself may never have fully known. Jose had an extensive criminal record. As a teenager, he had been arrested more than a dozen times. As an adult, he accumulated arrests involving drug trafficking, assaults, robberies, and numerous other offenses. Detectives also identified several allegations involving violence against former girlfriends, including at least one incident in which he was accused of threatening to kill a woman. By that stage, prosecutors believed they had more than enough evidence to move forward with a trial. Jose was volatile, controlling, jealous, and prone to violence, with a long history of substance abuse adding to the concern. And based on the way he communicated with Christine, prosecutors believed there was genuine resentment and hostility behind his words. Their theory was that he ultimately snapped and killed her during an alcohol-fueled outburst. As for Jose's claim that two unidentified men were responsible, investigators found absolutely nothing to support that story. They viewed hundreds of hours of surveillance footage from around the neighborhood and never found a single suspicious vehicle that could be connected to the alleged attackers. Inside the residence, detectives also failed to recover any foreign DNA that would support the presence of unknown intruders. The one mystery that continued to trouble investigators was Vanessa. The child was missing, and so were several essential items needed to care for her. Because of that, detectives began focusing on a different possibility. They suspected Jose may have handed Vanessa over to someone he trusted, someone willing to conceal her or move her somewhere else. But despite extensive searches and countless leads, investigators were never able to prove it. Jose never admitted to knowing where Vanessa was, and without stronger evidence, prosecutors couldn't charge him with kidnapping. There was another unusual detail as well. Investigators examined Jose's movements before he returned to his parents' home. While his parents lived in New Haven and Christine lived in Ansonia, cell phone location records showed he didn't travel directly between the two locations. Instead, he took a lengthy detour through a wooded area farther north. Detectives suspected he may have disposed of evidence there, particularly because the murder weapon was never recovered. In the end, Jose went to trial solely for Christine's murder, and the process took more than 5 years to reach a courtroom. The case finally went before a jury in the spring of 2025, and throughout that entire period, Jose never changed his story. He continued insisting that 2 unknown men were responsible. The defense focused heavily on one central argument. Investigators had no direct evidence placing Jose at the moment of the killing itself. According to them, the evidence only connected him to what happened afterward, specifically the cleanup. They also highlighted another detail. As investigators had previously revealed, Christine had a clump of hair clenched in her hand, suggesting she may have pulled it out while fighting for her life. DNA testing confirmed that the hair belonged to Jose. However, there was another discovery as well. Under Christine's fingernails, investigators recovered a separate biological sample that did not match Jose. To this day, authorities have never identified who that sample belonged to. Regarding the strange 911 call, Jose claimed he contacted emergency services because he had seen suspicious men approaching Christine's residence. According to him, he was so impaired that he couldn't properly communicate the address. He also offered an explanation for Christine's voice that was heard during the call. Jose claimed she hadn't noticed the men yet, and therefore didn't understand why he was contacting police. During the trial, Jose took the witness stand and spent hours explaining his version of events in great detail. But the longer he testified, the less convincing many jurors appeared to find his story. Prosecutors presented a timeline that simply fit the evidence more consistently. When deliberations began, the jury needed only 2 hours to reach a unanimous decision. Guilty on July 14, 2025, Jose was sentenced to 65 years in prison. His legal team immediately filed an appeal, and as of today, a final ruling has not yet been made. But even with Jose likely facing the remainder of his life behind bars, the case still felt unfinished, because Vanessa remained missing. Over the years, the FBI continued searching for her. Investigators repeatedly renewed public appeals, released age-progressed images showing what she might look like today, and even offered complete immunity to anyone who might be concealing her whereabouts. So far, none of those efforts have produced answers. Christine's family continues to believe that Vanessa is alive and was placed with someone Jose trusted after the murder. They haven't ruled out the possibility that she was taken out of the country altogether. But even if she remained nearby, identifying her after so many years would be extremely difficult. Still, they continue holding on to one hope that someday Jose decides to reveal the truth about what happened to her. Perhaps one day he could be offered some type of deal, the possibility of release late in life in exchange for that information. For now, however, he remains silent while waiting for the outcome of his appeal. Share your thoughts on this case in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like. Let's move on to the next case. A mother of 3 suddenly stopped returning calls. At first, when police were asked to check on her, it seemed like nothing more than a standard welfare check. But as investigators dug deeper, the situation began to unravel in ways no one expected. One surprising development led to another, and the case eventually headed in a direction that caught even seasoned detectives completely off guard. Crystal Grims was born on November 24, 1980. In Boulder, Colorado, she was raised in a large, close-knit family and developed a passion for dancing at a young age, regularly taking part in performances and local productions. Alongside her love for the arts, she had a strong interest in science and excelled academically, finishing high school near the top of her class. Her achievements earned her a scholarship to one of the nation's most respected universities, where she began studying biochemical engineering. Later, she transferred to the University of Colorado and completed her degree in the same field. After college, Crystal landed a position at a company that specialized in scientific software and laboratory equipment. It was a highly sought-after role that required an impressive background, and she secured it thanks largely to her exceptional academic accomplishments. It didn't take long for her to establish herself as a valuable member of the team, and over the years, she continued climbing the professional ladder. During that period, she met Daniel Koog, who worked as a data analyst for the State Department of Public Health and Environment. The couple married in 2007, and in the years that followed, they welcomed 2 daughters and a son. Life settled into a comfortable routine centered around family, work, and raising their children. For more than a decade, everything seemed stable and ordinary until 2023. In early October of that year, Crystal, then 42 years old, started her morning like any other. As she prepared to get the kids ready for school, she noticed a message on her phone that immediately caught her attention. It had been sent by a man named Anthony, someone she had dated briefly during college more than 2 decades earlier. Their relationship had lasted about a year before ending, and since then, they'd had only occasional contact. The fact that Anthony was reaching out after 23 years was strange enough, but what really surprised Crystal was what he had written. His message read, "Hi Crystal, it's Anthony. Hope it's okay. I looked you up. I'm in Boulder every few weeks and thought we could hook up. You game?" Crystal thought the message was bizarre. It was clear Anthony wasn't interested in reconnecting as friends and was instead suggesting something purely physical. She had absolutely no interest in that and chose not to reply. The following day, another message arrived. This time, the tone had shifted dramatically. Instead of trying to flirt, Anthony launched into a stream of insults. Stripped of the profanity, the message was essentially, "Are you there? You should have said yes when I offered. Whatever, I saw your pictures. You've gained weight. I bet your husband doesn't even want you. Stop wasting my time." Crystal was stunned. She couldn't understand why he was speaking to her that way. Since their breakup years earlier, they had only exchanged a handful of brief messages, and those conversations had always been polite and casual. About 5 years before, Anthony had unexpectedly contacted her and started reminiscing about their relationship. Crystal made it clear that she was happily married with 3 children and had no interest in revisiting the past. After that exchange, he blocked her on social media, and they hadn't spoken again. Now he had resurfaced out of nowhere, behaving in a way that seemed completely irrational. Crystal found herself wondering what had changed in his life during all the years they had spent apart. Even so, she didn't want to fuel the situation. Rather than respond or confront him, she simply ignored the message and moved on. For a while after that, Anthony went quiet, and Crystal started to hope he'd finally left her alone. But almost a month later, a third message came in, and this one terrified her. Anthony sent a photo of her husband getting out of his car in front of the building where he worked. From his clothes, Crystal could tell the picture had been taken that very day, which meant Anthony hadn't just figured out where her husband worked. He'd gone there and watched him. Along with the photo, Anthony started insulting her husband and added that he should drive more carefully because something on his car might end up getting damaged. So now this wasn't just name-calling anymore. It was a direct threat. Crystal was scared he might actually hurt her family. so she decided she had to go to the police. On Halloween, she filed a report explaining everything that had been happening and attaching all of Anoni's messages along with a photo. She also made it clear that she had never given him her phone number, email address, or any other personal contact information. The only way they'd ever communicated was through social media, and none of that data was listed on her profile. Police took the report, and 2 days later, a detective was assigned to the case. While he was still getting up to speed, Anthony sent another message. This time, he wrote that her license plates were expired and she should really get them renewed. He added that he'd also checked her husband's car and his plates were still fine. Crystal, who genuinely hadn't realized her plates were out of date, now knew for sure that Anthony had her home address and was actively watching her. Not long after that, he sent her a vulgar photo and another inappropriate picture. Then, other men started messaging her, saying they'd found her number on a hookup site. That's when Crystal realized Anthony had started posting her number on adult websites. Over the next few days, Crystal was living in constant fear. And what terrified her most was the thought that Anthony might somehow go after her children, who were 14, 11, and 8. Before long, the detective asked her to come down to the station, and she sat with him and went through everything that had happened, telling him how scared she was for her family's safety. He promised to look into it, and Crystal waited to hear what he would find out. About a week after Anthony first reached out, she went to a dentist appointment. When she walked out of the office and checked her phone, there was another message from him. This time, Anthony wrote that he'd been watching her during the appointment from his car, and that he'd done something disgusting to her vehicle. Crystal drove straight to the detective and showed him the message. She pointed out that no one knew she had the dentist appointment, which meant Anthony literally had to be following her around town and tracking her every move. The detective told her he'd uncovered a few important details. Anthony wasn't using a normal phone number. He was messaging her through an app that assigns users random phone numbers, which makes them hard to trace. On top of that, the detective found out that Anthony did have a personal Verizon cell number, but he never used it to contact Crystal. He stuck to the anonymous texting service. In other words, he'd set things up so it would be difficult for police to prove he was the one behind the harassment. After leaving the station, Crystal went straight home and locked herself inside until her husband returned. She was too afraid to drive anywhere, knowing Anthony could be nearby at any moment. After the day at the dentist, Anthony suddenly went quiet again, and over the next couple of weeks, Crystal started to think he might finally have backed off. But on November 12th, about 6 weeks after the very first message, he reached out again. This time, he went back to pushing her for something sexual and wrote that he was willing to get rid of her husband because he didn't satisfy her and she was supposed to be with Anthony instead. He added that the security at her husband's workplace was terrible and that he'd been able to walk into the building without anyone stopping him. Crystal was panicking at the moment she read that message. Her husband was actually at work. So, she called the police right away. Officers went to Daniel's office, checked the building, and didn't find Anthony anywhere. They also couldn't confirm that he'd ever been inside. But on one point, he wasn't lying. The building's security was extremely lax, so it was entirely possible he could have slipped in unnoticed. A little while later, he messaged again and said he was still waiting for her approval to take care of her husband. Meanwhile, the official investigation wasn't going anywhere fast. The detective found out Anthony moved constantly, which made it hard to pin down a current address. The only solid information he could get was 2 previous addresses in other states, one in Idaho and one in Utah. He also tried to get a warrant for account records tied to the messages Anthony was sending, but someone at the police department messed up the paperwork, and the judge denied. They had to start the whole process over. And since the case wasn't classified as an immediate life or death emergency, getting that warrant could take weeks. In the end, Crystal and her husband basically had to start doing their own legwork. They dug up everything they could find about Anthony and opened sources, old addresses, phone numbers, and handed it all to the police. Daniel also hired a private investigator and installed security cameras around their home in case Anthony ever showed up there. Even with all that, the police kept working the case at a slow, cautious pace. They didn't even try to contact Anthony directly, saying they didn't yet have enough to confront him. All of this took a serious toll on Crystal. She was afraid to leave the house, jumped at every phone call and notification, and more than anything, she was terrified that Anthony might shift his focus to her kids. And through all of this, the messages kept coming. They weren't as openly threatening as before, but he still made it very clear he was watching them, commenting on where she'd been and sending more photos of her husband taken in different parts of town. This went on until December 14th, 2023, 2 months after Anthony first reached out. Crystal's husband called police and said she hadn't answered his calls or texts for 3 hours. He was at work in a neighboring city, and Crystal should have already been home after meeting with the detective to hear about any progress in the case. With everything going on with Anthony, Daniel immediately started to panic. But he couldn't get back quickly enough to check on her himself. So, he called the police and asked them to do a welfare check. Detective Martinez, who was handling the case, was alarmed right away. He didn't have any meetings scheduled with Crystal that day, and she hadn't reached out to him at all. Officers started to wonder if she discovered something new or was planning to bring them important information. Headed to the station, and for some reason, never made it there. They drove out to the house, but no one came to the door. The officers walked around the property several times, peeking through every window they could, but saw no movement inside. At that point, Daniel was already driving home from work, and the kids were still at school. While they were waiting for him to arrive, the officers decided to check the small garage windows up near the ceiling. The main windows were covered with curtains, so they couldn't see in. But they pulled the patrol car right up next to the garage, climbed onto it, and looked through the high windows. As soon as they did, they saw a woman lying motionless on the garage floor in a pool of blood. They called for an ambulance and forced the front door, then rushed into the garage. They immediately recognized Crystal. She had no pulse, but her body was still warm. Paramedics tried to resuscitate her, but there was nothing they could do. From the very beginning, detectives could see they were dealing with a homicide. Crystal's body showed obvious stab wounds, and there was a blood stain on the wall next to her. Her body was sent to the medical examiner while officers started working the scene. First, they confirmed there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. When police arrived, every door and window was closed. Another strange detail stood out right away. The front door security camera that Crystal and her husband had installed just a few weeks earlier had been covered with duct tape. Around the house, there were 3 more cameras, but all of them had been switched off right around the time of the murder, so detectives couldn't pull any useful footage. Afterward, all 3 cameras came back online as normal, which led police to believe the killer had managed to disable them only for the window of time needed to commit the crime. Crystal's body was lying at the bottom of the stairs, leading from the house down into the garage. Her purse and car keys were on the floor next to her. It looked like she had been about to go somewhere when the attack happened. Detectives also noticed something else. Inside her purse was a handgun that she and her husband had bought after all the harassment and threats from Anthony had started. For some reason, Crystal never even got the chance to pull it out, which raised a major question. Whoever attacked her had to get into the house without leaving any trace of a break-in and hit her so suddenly that she didn't have time to react. One theory was that the killer had gotten hold of a spare key and hidden in the garage, waiting for Crystal to come down the stairs to leave. The medical examiner later found that Crystal had been struck twice in the head with a blunt object and had a stab wound to her side. All of this fit the idea that she'd been taken completely off guard. It looks like the killer had hit her before she could even reach for the gun, leaving her no chance to defend herself. From the very first hours of the investigation, detectives were convinced this had to lead back to Anthony, the man who'd been stalking Crystal for months. Now that the case had been reclassified as a homicide, they quickly got a warrant for his arrest and began searching for him. Before long, they learned he might be living in the neighboring state of Utah and reached out to local police to check the address on file. Officers went to that house, and sure enough, Anthony was there. They started asking questions, but he acted like he had no idea what they were talking about. When they asked when he'd last been in contact with Crystal, he told them it was 2014, 9 years earlier. He insisted he hadn't spoken to her since, and absolutely had not been stalking her. Detectives hadn't really expected him to confess on the spot, but things quickly started to get strange. Utah officers had shown up at Anoni's home just a few hours after Crystal was killed, and he was calmly sitting in his living room. The problem was the drive from his house to Crystal's town was about 8 hours. Investigators checked whether he could have pulled it off by flying back instead, but found no record of him on any flight, and even by plane. The timing would have been extremely tight, if not impossible. On top of that, around the time Crystal was murdered, Anthony was at a store with his wife buying a sweater. That was backed up by solid evidence. So, detectives suddenly found themselves asking a disturbing question. Was it possible that Anthony had sent all those messages but had nothing to do with the actual killing? Anthony stuck to his story. He said he hadn't messaged Crystal in years and even let police go through his smartphone without a warrant. Given that the stalker had used anonymous apps with different numbers, detectives didn't really expect to find a neat, obvious trail on his phone anyway. They considered the possibility of a second phone or a laptop being used, but Anthony told them they could check all his devices, and they still didn't find anything useful. Digging deeper, investigators eventually concluded that Anthony had been in Utah the entire time, including during moments when the stalker was telling Crystal he was watching her. So, not only did detectives fail to link Anthony to the murder, they'd practically proven he was unlikely to be involved at all. Unless, of course, he'd somehow pulled off a plan so intricate the police simply weren't capable of untangling it. Looking for answers, investigators finally got the warrants they needed and brought in the department's tech unit. Digital forensic experts started digging into the stalker's messages, his accounts, the photos he'd sent, and every bit of data they could pull. Before long, they tracked down an IP address and discovered that the messages were being sent over Wi-Fi from a specific location. But it wasn't in Utah, where Anthony lives. It was inside the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, the exact building where Daniel, Crystal's husband, worked. Detectives, who had not been expecting that twist at all, started digging even deeper. The tech team told them all the messages had come from a so-called burner phone, and when police traced the purchase, they found it had been paid for with a gift card. Store records showed that the card had been issued in Daniel's name. After that, detectives went back to Crystal's friends and family, and they added even more context. It turned out that before the stalking ever began, Crystal and Daniel's marriage was already falling apart. She had told people close to her more than once that she was planning to file for divorce, and that she couldn't stand living with him anymore. Her mother also mentioned that Daniel could be rough with the kids and even hit them. Because of that, Crystal was planning to seek full custody and use photos of their bruises to make sure he'd never be able to hurt them again. By then, Crystal and Daniel had been living in separate rooms for quite a while, and had basically split their finances. But once the messages from Anthony started, her focus shifted almost entirely to dealing with the stalker, and the divorce plans were pushed to the back burner. Once they had all of that in hand, police asked Daniel to come back into the station. This time, they started carefully feeling him out, without putting all their cards on the table at once. At first, the detectives walked him through where the investigation stood and mentioned that Anthony had a rock-solid alibi, at least for the time of the murder. Daniel said he had no idea who other than Anthony would want to hurt his wife, and added that now he was afraid for himself and his children, because the real killer was still out there. That's when the detective slowly shifted the conversation to what the tech team had found and told him that the stalker's messages had been sent from Daniel's work Wi-Fi. Daniel immediately offered an explanation for that. According to him, Anthony had come by his workplace, taken photos, and even gone inside the building more than once. Everyone there used the same Wi-Fi password, and the login and password were posted outside each office, so Anthony could have easily seen them while walking through the department. But the detective told him that still didn't really add up, and then laid out a different theory. One very carefully worded, so it didn't directly accuse Daniel of murder, but nudged him toward admitting that he'd been the one behind the stalking. The detective suggested that with the marriage falling apart, Daniel might have come up with a plan to keep Crystal from leaving, and at the same time test whether she'd be interested in another man. So he started messaging her as her ex, trying to pull her into something sexual. And when that didn't work, he escalated to threats so she'd feel genuinely unsafe. All the while, Daniel was ramping up security at home, hiring a private investigator and playing the role of protector, hoping Crystal would decide she needed him and shouldn't walk away and face this danger alone. The detective was hoping Daniel would at least admit to being the fake Anthony, which would make it much easier to link him to the murder later, but Daniel kept insisting he had nothing to do with any of it. With nothing concrete to hold him on, they had to let him go and kept looking for more evidence. They confirmed that only 2 people had the passwords to access the home security cameras, Crystal and Daniel. In a previous interview, the detectives had asked Daniel why the camera suddenly went offline around the time of the murder, and he hadn't been able to give any kind of clear explanation. They also learned that, on the day of the killing, Daniel showed up to work about half an hour later than usual, which in theory gave him enough time to commit the murder and get rid of evidence. Since Crystal's body was found around noon, that meant she must have been lying there for several hours before he called police. Daniel, for his part, said the reason he was late was nothing more than diarrhea. According to him, he'd just spent that extra half hour in the bathroom. Sometime later, Crystal's mother shared something else that bothered her. She'd been staying at the house full-time, helping with the kids. And in the very first days after the murder, she noticed Daniel was already throwing out Crystal's clothes and other personal things. He also told her he planned to sell the house as soon as possible. On top of that, he didn't seem grief-stricken or even particularly upset. Instead, he was mostly irritated that the police were looking at him and kept complaining that they were trying to set him up. All of that was still just circumstantial and hard to rely on. But soon, detectives got something much stronger. Over several days, they collected footage from all the home security cameras up and down Crystal Street. After watching hundreds of hours from different angles, they were confident that not a single unfamiliar person or vehicle had approached the house that morning. With the way all those cameras overlapped, it was basically impossible. In other words, if someone else had killed her, that person would have had to show up on at least one of the neighbor systems. Since no one did, police were left with only 2 options. Either Daniel, who was already in the house, committed the murder, or the killer somehow materialized in the garage and then vanished off the street without being seen. Detectives also pointed out that there were no signs of forced entry and no evidence of a struggle inside. Even though the marriage was in trouble, Crystal never truly believed her husband was capable of killing her, which is probably why she never even considered reaching for the firearm she had tucked away in her bag. As detectives continued piecing together the evidence, they eventually formed a theory of exactly what they believed had happened. According to investigators, Daniel's original goal wasn't murder. They believed he created the fake identity of Anthony and began stalking Crystal in an effort to stop her from going through with the divorce. Maybe he thought that by frightening her, she'd be too scared to leave the marriage and take the children with her. Or perhaps he imagined that by positioning himself as the person protecting her from this supposed threat, he could somehow repair their relationship. Detectives also believe Daniel intentionally sent messages from Anthony that hinted he might harm Daniel, while also taking those unsettling surveillance-style photographs, hoping Crystal would become concerned for her husband's safety and reconnect with him emotionally. But as time passed, things got out of control. Crystal became far more alarmed than Daniel had anticipated. She began researching Anthony, gathering information, and staying in close contact with law enforcement. At that point, Daniel allegedly realized that if the investigation continued, his entire scheme could come crashing down. And if the truth came out, he could be facing serious criminal charges, along with the possibility of losing his children, his career, his reputation, and everything else he had built. Detectives believe that, feeling trapped by the situation he had created, Daniel convinced himself that murder was the only way to protect himself. Their theory was that he planned to kill Crystal and leave police chasing a suspect who never actually existed. Then, he could keep the house, the children, and his freedom. Investigators say that on the morning of the murder, Daniel deliberately stayed home after the children left for school and waited until Crystal was alone in the garage, preparing to leave. They believe he approached her unexpectedly and struck her multiple times in the head with a heavy object, knocking her unconscious. Afterward, he allegedly stabbed her once in the chest before driving to work, disposing of the weapon and any incriminating evidence along the way. Just 2 days later, on December 16th, police arrested Daniel and charged him with first-degree murder, stalking, and criminal impersonation. He pleaded not guilty, hired a defense attorney, and the case moved toward trial. When proceedings finally began in April 2025, prosecutors had gathered even more evidence against him. Investigators discovered that on the day of the killing, Daniel had searched online for things like how severe a head injury must be before it's dangerous, how hard someone would need to be struck to lose consciousness, and how long a person could remain unconscious before suffering brain damage. Then another significant witness came forward. A woman who had dated Daniel during high school and college contacted investigators and described behavior that sounded disturbingly familiar. She explained that after ending their relationship more than 2 decades earlier, she began receiving threatening messages from people claiming to be Daniel's friends and acquaintances. The messages pressured her to get back together with him and warned her that leaving him had been a mistake. Eventually, she realized the messages weren't coming from those people at all. According to her, Daniel had been impersonating them the entire time. Fearing the threats might escalate, she sought a restraining order, and once it was granted, the messages stopped. Throughout the trial, the defense emphasized that investigators never recovered the murder weapon and found no blood evidence inside Daniel's vehicle or on his clothing. But the jury ultimately found the rest of the evidence far more convincing. After deliberations, they returned a guilty verdict. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Crystal's murder, along with an additional 9.5 years for the stalking and impersonation charges. And with that, the bizarre and tragic case finally came to a close. In the end, Daniel's actions left his 3 children without either parent in their lives. They are now being raised by Crystal's brother and his wife, with support from other family members who are doing everything they can to provide the children with stability and a chance at a normal future. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like.